Hello. Today for our fifth learning module, I'm going to address several areas in our reading: multiplicity, ethics and vulnerability, and learning leadership. I'm going to touch on boundaries and have you look at some video resources from the Faith Trust Institute. I will provide some instructions for you on how you can access those. They are free for you to use in this class, and you'll have 1 week to access them, and I'll post all of that on Brightspace. These have been used by denominations for training clergy. So if you've seen them, it's always a good idea to revisit and review and perhaps focus on a part that you haven't focused on before of these. You will also read chapters 8 and 9 in Pamela Cooper White's book. These are, again, rather technical in terms of psychoanalytic theory, but they also provide good theological discussion on notions of good and evil as a backdrop to our discussion of ethics. And I will distill this a bit for our purposes. Also, you will look at some chapters in Will Willimon's book and Callahan, who talk about learning to lead, learning over time, the long arc of learning, I believe she calls it. And I encourage you to read these chapters for their good practical wisdom. So Cooper White talks about the notion of splitting in the self-psychology of Kohut. She addresses the question of damaging, destructive, and unhealthy forms of multiplicity. Vertical splitting is manifested in behaviors, sometimes compulsive, that one often does not know or understand why he or she is doing them. Behaviors that don't represent who the person is or wants to be. As in Paul's, "I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do." We may see this in persons in our congregation, but as we are all human, we also see this among pastoral leaders. She talks about the theory of evil as a lack of good, a void, the Augustinian view. But many people in their suffering do experience evil as an active force, a thing, not just a lack. And often in the experience of trauma, evil is perceived as a real presence. Related to the evil as a lack theory, self-psychology posits that splitting occurs because there has been an absence or lack of parental provision or neglect. In the void of parental care, one splits off a self where the lack is, and so there is a self-state that is presented to the world as having it all together, and then the disavowed or repressed self that seeks to fill that void with compulsive behavior. In cases of trauma, there is often dissociation or a disconnect from reality and self because you escape into other thoughts. There can be distortion of memory. Sometimes it is reliving difficult memories or flashbacks, and sometimes it's blocking those memories to the point of amnesia. The destructive or at least unhealthy splitting explains in part behaviors that we see and leads to specialized treatments designed to break through to help persons reintegrate these selves. But of course, Pamela Cooper White has critiqued the idea of a core or essential self. We all have split selves to a degree. Willimon talks about Jung's persona in terms of ministry, the persona of the clergy. But Cooper White's point is multiplicity of the self makes way for new relations, new relationships. Our multiple selves allow us to know the other. So there is fluidity moving between multiplicity, but with also a sense of self-cohesion or differentiation. That is the braid that holds it all together. The fact that we are a stranger to some of our own selves allows us to be in relation with other strangers because we know what that is like. This multiplicity is key in healthy relationships and has ethical ramifications for how we relate to each other. I want to talk a little bit about vulnerability, both individual vulnerability and congregational vulnerability, because it ties into the question of ethics in ministry. Actually, there is a real sense of global vulnerability that has arisen in postmodernity. The measure of harm, violence, and of course, pandemics. We talk about vulnerable populations. The Latin roots of the word vulnerable are wounds and wounding. And often our woundedness, our vulnerability, feels very physical. Our emotional hurt is sometimes described in physical terms, like that really opened up an old wound for me, or he or she tore a strip off of me, or I feel like I have been through the ringer. Christian theology's attention to moral and spiritual wounding has tended to focus on sin. One dominant strand of the Christian tradition implied that vulnerability and the suffering to which it exposes us are the punitive response of divine justice to human sin. The biblical account of the fall attributes human vulnerability to suffering, to sin, a curse meted out by God. So there was the sense that suffering, vulnerability, is punishment, and redemption meant liberation from sin and removal of vulnerability. Along with that was the idea of divine impassivity, a Greek philosophical inheritance in early Christianity, that God is incapable of feeling our pain, not passible, that God is armored. We came to have a triumphant notion of God as winning out over suffering and evil. However, it's also a biblical notion that humans are susceptible to ill and to good, susceptible to suffering harm, but also to be healed and made whole. There is resilience and coping. Consider the story of Jacob wrestling with the divine stranger. We have Jacob wrestling through the night with the mysterious stranger who leaves a wound. So he leaves Jacob limping, but he also leaves a blessing. Some theological studies of vulnerability, notably the work of Henry Nouwen in The Wounded Healer, and more recently Elizabeth Gandolfo in her work The Power and Vulnerability of Love, stress divine vulnerability, as in the crucifixion when Jesus cries out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" So the impassibility of God is challenged by the divine pathos, the passion of Christ, divine vulnerability. Even in liberation and feminist theologies, there was a sense that we must eliminate vulnerability to suffering. Whatever oppresses, whatever causes us to suffer must be eradicated. And so I'm a feminist, and so I can relate to that position, certainly. And there is great danger in glorifying suffering too much. The suffering teaches us something, and that's why some women stay in abusive relationships. But vulnerability to suffering cannot be eliminated. It's part of what makes us human, to live here. Suffering is not good or salvific in itself, but a part of life. Elizabeth Gandolfo says that rather than looking at suffering or vulnerability as a punishment for sin, what we should be asking is, what is it about our fundamental structure and condition as human beings that makes us capable and even desirous of inflicting terrible suffering on others and ourselves? It is imperative, she says, that we probe the depths of the human heart to uncover why we who are made in the image of divine love fail so miserably to love. Vulnerability not only exposes human beings to harm, it is also the condition for the possibility of healing, health, and wholeness. So also are churches vulnerable to change, decline, conflict, among other things. John Calvin wrote that Christians and their churches are formed of the same stuff as the rest of earthly life. They remain vulnerable, mortal, fallible. What is needed is not an overcoming of our earthiness, but the strengthening and restoration of vulnerable creatures by the grace of God. This is Calvin as quoted in Gandolf's book. But because we don't like to feel vulnerable, we create strategies of invulnerability. These are our attempts to preserve an invisible ideal. In the person, Cooper White notes the behaviors that may come out of a person's experience of parental neglect or trauma. In congregations, those strategies of invulnerability can look like resistance to change, clinging to the past, close-mindedness, or dogmatism. But while we may want to avoid it, vulnerability is also the birthplace of joy, belonging, creativity, authenticity, and love. And that last piece was from the writings of Brené Brown, a popular sociologist. And she's the one who says vulnerability is the birthplace of joy, belonging, creativity, authenticity, and love. The Christian tradition has always remembered suffering in relation to redemption, return from exile, resurrection. Thus, the memory of suffering is linked to the promise of a future in which suffering will not have the last word. Because of this vulnerability in congregations and our own vulnerability as leaders, I want to talk about professionalism and ethics in ministry. Kaelin wrote that professionalism and that model of ministry in her book. And now there's some critique of that model, which can serve to put pastors on a pedestal. It can be hierarchical and can pacify the laity and give the sense that because they don't have expertise, they can't do anything. An alternative model might be called the friendship model of ministry, which sees the pastoral leader as just another person or friend in the community. Feminist Carter Hayward has critiqued the notion of boundaries in ministry because she says they are primarily for the protection of the self. They are armors that deny our vulnerability, and they hold hierarchical power in place. And she says boundaries are a Western notion because North Americans like their own space. And she argues for more intimacy in ministry. And while she may have some good points, obviously there are several things wrong with the friendship model. We are human. You will have friendships with some more than others. And this can create cliques and jealousy in congregations. We are called to love people, but you probably won't like everybody equally. And friendship is not an absolute. It's not perfect. Our friendships are subject to fail. They have ups and downs. They can be manipulated. As in, you are my friend, so you will vote my way on this congregational matter. Friendships can relativize or compromise your role as prophet and teacher. Jesus was friends with his disciples to a point, but he also confronted them, and he stood out from among them. So I'm going to have you watch one or more of the 4 videos from the Faith Trust Institute. They're not very long, about 25 minutes each. Marie Fortune, the founder, has developed these resources on healthy boundaries for clergy and congregations that I found very helpful and practical. Relationships between pastoral leaders and parishioners bring issues of power into play, and right relationships are critical. in a time when the credibility of the church is at stake, when there has been abuse by clerical leaders. Because of our vulnerability on both sides, we need to think about our commitments, responsibilities, and leadership. As Will Willimon states, transformative leadership is a community effort. It's not just directed at individuals, not just existential, and the church is a moral community. This is not to say that we are all good or always right, but we exist together for truth and love. I'll close today with his claim that ethics is an exercise of the imagination, a disciplined attempt to believe that God really is active in our lives, making a way when we thought there was none, by forgiveness, enabling us to act more courageously.